I have just accepted Her Majesty the Queen's kind invitation to form a new government.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's fantastic to be back.
In this new era, we're taking a new approach.
It will be uncensorable and uncancelable.
We can't give in to those who say we can't do better.
That is a disgrace.
We can make the West great again.
The status quo is not an option.
Welcome to the Liz Truss Show. It's the year 2026. Tens of thousands of British girls have been raped by Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs over a period of 40 years. There's been an industrial-scale cover-up and whitewash, and yet no one in authority has been held to account. Pakistani Muslim immigrants came to Britain in the 1960s, and many settled in declining industrial towns like Rotherham, Rochdale, Oldham and Bradford for work in mills and factories. By the 1970s and 80s, there were rumours of organised sexual abuse targeting young white British girls by groups of these men working in taxis, takeaways or markets. This abuse escalated in the 1990s and exploded in the 2000s, with cases in towns like Rotherham, where girls as young as 11 were targeted. Places across the country, including Oxford and Telford, were also affected. The perpetrators had the same modus operandi. Adult men plied victims with alcohol, drugs and rides in taxis to isolate and exploit them. Girls were raped by hundreds of men. They were tortured in unspeakable ways. Some even died. And this is still happening today. The girls were ignored and neglected due to a toxic British combination of political correctness and snobbery. The Labour government under Blair was desperate to present a happy vision of a multicultural society where diversity was a strength. The greatest crime was to be racist or Islamophobic. And an unaccountable technocratic state grew, where police were following targets and not trusted to exercise their own judgment or integrity. Rather than properly investigate these crimes, police forces turned a blind eye. Workers at care homes run by local councils saw girls being picked up in cars and returned bruised and dirty. The NHS saw children of 12 or 13 with chlamydia in their vaginas and mouths and getting pregnant. No questions were asked. No action was taken. The victims were working-class white girls, from care homes, broken families, and poor. The Liberal establishment often blamed them for the abuse, calling them prostitutes, tarts, or white slags, who lived chaotic lives. To the Pakistani Muslims who abused them, they were a racial target. They said white girls are only good for sex, or kafir, a derogatory term for non-Muslims. They said white girls don't obey Allah, they don't dress modestly, they show the curves of their bodies, and therefore deserve to be punished. Eventually, the rape gangs began to get wider notice. In 2007, journalist Andrew Norfolk investigated the issue in The Times, identifying that a fear of racism was preventing justice. In 2013, Parliament's Home Affairs Committee criticised police for organising evidence due to political correctness. And in 2017, the BBC documentary 3 Girls brought the issue to mass attention. Yet although some perpetrators were brought to justice, further coverage was suppressed. In 2025, Elon Musk took up the cause, and each time the anger of the public about this outrage flared up, until it has been doused down and suppressed. Under the Conservative government, the same failing system remained in place. I am angry and disgusted at the way that these girls continue to be let down, and the apparent inability to anyone to take on the deeply corrupt authorities that have let this happen. It's a huge stain on our country. One courageous detective, Constable Maggie Oliver at the Greater Manchester Metropolitan Police, worked on 2 operations, Operation Augusta in Manchester and Operation Span in Rochdale. What happened horrified her. She saw investigations being stopped by senior officers. She saw a complicit Crown Prosecution Service, Frustrated by police and CPS failures and their betrayal of witnesses, she resigned in late 2012. She went public on her concerns and the continuing whitewash. In this week's episode of the Liz Truss Show, I talked to Maggie about why justice has not been done and why senior figures have not been held to account. We discussed the sway that Muslim community leaders have and the desperation of the British establishment to cover up the reality of these crimes. Finally, we talk about what is needed to take on the corrupt system. Please subscribe to the Liz Truss Show if you aren't already. Please also subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, where as well as this show, there are the Liz Truss Show podcasts on Mondays and Wednesdays. Today I'm here in Manchester with Maggie Oliver, formerly of the Greater Manchester Police. She now runs her own foundation, the Maggie Oliver Foundation, which is all about holding those accountable who failed to take action on Britain's grooming gangs. Maggie, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
When did you first become aware of the issue of grooming gangs?
In 2004, I joined the police in 1997. I was already unusual in that I was 42 years old, a mother of 4, and I very quickly went into serious crime. I did a short spell in child protection, but realised it wasn't actually for me. So I went into the major incident team, mostly working on murders, kidnappings, witness intimidation, witness protection. And then in 2004, I was approached and asked to join a new job that became known as Operation Augusta. Until that moment, when I began to speak to social workers all around Manchester city centre and going to care homes, I didn't even know that this kind of child abuse that now is referred to as grooming gangs, many victims prefer it to be called rape gangs. I didn't even know that existed. But the modus operandi on Augusta was the same as we talk about today. So it was predominantly Pakistani Muslim men, much older than their victims, who were very vulnerable young white children. And on Augusta, all of those children lived in care homes. Within the space of a few months, we'd identified 97 men who were raping these children on a daily basis, passing them around. We knew where the locations were, what the car registration numbers were, phone numbers, who they were. We knew who the victims were. And my husband was terminally ill. And I went off work with that job as a full major investigation. In March 2005, it had gone to the major incident team. I returned to work after my husband died. The whole job had been buried. Not one of those men had been prosecuted. None of the rapes were recorded, and I was in complete and utter shock. It's never left me until this day. So I went back to my normal job because I didn't have one scrap of paper, but I knew what I'd seen and I knew what had happened.
So can you just tell us a bit about what was actually going on the ground? How many girls were affected by those, 97 perpetrators?
Yeah, well,
that you talk about?
Yeah, we'd identified about 36 children at that point, Liz. But subsequently, when I resigned and went public, Andy Burnham put together 2 independent reviews initially, one into Augusta and one into Rochdale, because he'd heard me on the radio going on. That report was made public. We had a press conference in January 2020, and the official findings of that report, that there were in excess of 75 children. And even that was the tip of the iceberg. So Greater Manchester Police, the decision to close down Augusta was made in the Gold Command Group at GMP, which was made up of the Chief Constable, head of the assistant chief constable in charge of crime, the head of child protection. It was a deliberate decision to close it down. The report in 2020, the official reason given was that GMP said they decided they wouldn't put resources into it. And so they abandoned all those children, let all those abusers continue to rape children. And it was only after that report in 2020 that they were forced to reopen that case. Those men had been left to abuse more children. They still haven't been charged. It was renamed Operation Green Jacket. It is still ongoing. But I think that it gave me everything I had said was proved to be true. And yet, for 20 years, nobody wanted to act. And I would say, actually, they've been dragged kicking and screaming to do something about this. This has been my life for 20 years. We're getting a lot more coverage of it now, but the coverage is nothing new to me. I was horrified the first time I became aware of this kind of child abuse. What I can still not get my head around is how a chief constable or a home secretary or the head of social services can know what I knew and still decide that these children don't matter, that we're not going to do anything about these child abusers, and we are just going to leave these kids to their fate. That is gross criminal neglect, in my opinion. It's misconduct in a public office. And yet, to date, not one of those senior public servants has ever been held to account. And that's why I can't let go of this.
And who was the chief constable in Greater Manchester at the time?
It was Mike Todd, who subsequently committed suicide. The head of child protection then was Steve Haywood. The head of serious crime was Dave Jones. And after the independent report in 2020, those officers, 5 of them I think, were referred to the IOPC, the Independent Office for Police Conduct. Quite conveniently, the minutes of those meetings where that decision was made have gone astray. And so eventually the IOPC, I did many hours of interviews for them. The evidence was there that that job had been closed down. And yet still, with all that, nobody was held to account.
And so what are these people doing now?
They're all retired on big fat pensions. Dave Jones became the chief constable of, I think it was North Yorkshire Police. And you might find it interesting to know that within days of finding out that Augusta was being formally investigated by the independent review team in Manchester, even though he just extended his contract with the police as the chief constable, within days he resigned and he left to draw his pension, which he's still doing.
What about the council? Because
Yeah.
you know these girls were in care.
Yeah.
That's a responsibility of the local council. What was going on there?
Willful blindness, closing their eyes and pretending that they didn't know. They did know. And what you might be interested to know, Liz, is that, hindsight is great. I've learned such a lot in the last 20 years. But at the time that Augusta was put together, we had a little girl called Victoria Agolia who had been given a drugs overdose by one of her abusers it was actually in Rochdale in 2004. She was 15 and she died. At exactly that time, a documentary team had been following a social services team in Bradford in South Yorkshire, and they had uncovered this kind of abuse with Pakistani Muslim men targeting and abusing vulnerable white children in that community. At that time, the national policing, the head of policing throughout the country, they had sought an injunction to prevent that programme going out. And at exactly that time, Victoria had died in Manchester. I now believe that the reason Augusta was pulled together was because they feared riots in the street when the documentary went out. And GMP, I believe, wanted to be able to say at that point, when they were asked, have you got a similar problem in Manchester? This little girl has died. She was being abused by gangs of men. GMP would have said, well, we're not sure yet, but we've got an investigation looking into it. When the programme went out and there wasn't riots in the street, GMP then decided, in my opinion, that they wanted to get rid of this job. And at that point, none of the rapes had been officially recorded as rapes. There was only me that's ever spoken about it in the last 20 years. And unfortunately, I went public. But they thought they could bury this job. Nobody would know about it. That little girl, Victoria, died of a drugs overdose. The council were, in my opinion, negligent because she was crying out for help for years. The inquest into her death, in my opinion, again, was a complete cover-up. And as part of the 2020 report, they were instructed to reopen the inquest. Grandma is now in her 80s. She's completely blind. She was promised that this would happen quickly. 6 years later, we are still waiting for that new inquest. Now, the question to be asked is, why is it taking 6 years? Why is it all being hidden? What are they hiding? So the cover-ups and the power, the abuse of power in high places continues. And it's only through people like me and survivors continuing to share these truths that very gradually we're seeing a little bit of movement, but not enough, not quickly enough, and still nobody has been held accountable.
So you were dealing with these senior police officers on a regular basis.
Yeah.
What do you think was going through their heads? Because surely you don't join the police to exonerate criminals. I mean, that's not what motivates people to join the police. So what pressure was being put on them? Where was it coming from? What did you see happening that could explain their complete failure?
You know what, Liz? Back then I was very naive. I couldn't really make sense of it, but I didn't understand. I never understood why. And there was never for me a good enough reason as to why that job was closed down. But I've thought about this many years over the past 20 years. And what you've said there is absolutely right. Because, when I joined the police, as every other police officer, you swear an oath of attestation. Yeah, and you promise to uphold the law, to act with integrity, to uphold fundamental human rights, to protect the vulnerable. And that's what I promised to do, as does every other police officer. My opinion now is that in order to get higher up in these public institutions, you get to a certain level, and then you are being tested as to whether you will toe the line. Where is your real loyalty? Does it lie with these vulnerable children who have nobody fighting their corner, who are being judged? Who cares about them? Who is going to cause trouble for you? Nobody. And if you can't put your conscience to one side and put the progress or protecting the organization above what you know in your heart is what you are meant to be doing, because it's morally abhorrent to abandon a 12-year-old child to daily rapes by gangs of men who destroy that child's life forever. But I now believe that if you can't let go of your conscience and your primary loyalty cannot be to the organization, you don't get beyond a certain rank. And I think that is the same in most public institutions. I mean, you were the Prime Minister, and the cabinet. To get to the cabinet, you are going to have to make tough choices. And sometimes there is going to be a conflict, I would imagine, with what you think, what you believe. Now, maybe the subject matters are different, but in the police, I firmly believe now that decisions are made for the good of the organisation. And when you look at the official reasoning for closing down Augusta, because they wouldn't put resources in, that means that they thought the money they would have to spend on that job wasn't worth it. And you know what? At that point, when Augusta was running, police forces were being rewarded or funded based on their performance indicators. So, acquisitive crime, burglaries, theft from vehicles, robberies, police forces and chief constables were getting bonuses to tick boxes. So, if you reported somebody breaking into your car to pinch your radio, you would have every police officer on the division there because it would get a high category. If you were a child in care that was missing from home every day of the week, that was, you knew that they were in a property they shouldn't be in, nobody would respond. And that's what horrified me as a mum of 4, joining the police at 42. I could not get my head around how these children, many children, were just seen as a nuisance, that they were abandoned, that they were being neglected. And to me as a mum, they needed protecting. And my primary duty wasn't to go and attend to a car being broken into. It was to protect that child. It was to prosecute that child's rapist and make sure that they went to prison for a long, long time. And I found very early on that I, in many ways, was a lone voice. I was very much a square peg in a round hole. But I was also recognised as the person that these children would talk to. So I went back to my normal duties after Augusta. My husband had died. I was a single parent. I went back to major crime until in 2010 I was approached, headhunted really, because we had got a new job in GMP, which became the biggest job that GMP were handling, and that became the Rochdale grooming gang, Operation Spam. That job had already been investigated 2 years before by the divisional CID. One of the children who had been abused had been 12 at the time of the first abuse. Her main abuser, but one of many, this was Ruby out of the drama. When she was just 13, her main abuser got her pregnant and she had a termination. The police and social services seized the fetus when she had the termination unlawfully. They didn't speak to her. They didn't get consent from her mum. These children weren't living in care homes. They were in family homes that were difficult homes. So the children were still very vulnerable, but for different reasons. So Ruby had a termination. The police seized the fetus intending to seek DNA, but they didn't because they closed down that Rochdale case. 2 years later, there was a routine property review within GMP and that fetus was found. And when it was found, they had to open Operation Spam. And I was brought in to, amongst other children, to try to gain the trust of Ruby, to gain the trust of the family and try and persuade them to provide evidence to prosecute not only her abuser, but many other abusers. And I told the big bosses, no, I'm not doing this again. What I saw in Augusta stayed with me. I was really traumatized by what I knew was still going on. And I said, I'm not prepared to put myself through this again when you potentially will just close it down again and abandon children who were being abused. And I was given documents, policy documents to say this will absolutely not happen again. And I went away and I thought about it. The other child that I was asked to engage was her sister, Amber from the drama. She'd been arrested as a child on suspicion of being a madam, but the top lawyer in the CPS at the time, the head of the complex case unit, scrutinised what had happened 2 years before, and said that Amber should never have been arrested. She was a victim. She always had been, and we needed her in this prosecution. So I went away, thought about it, and decided that if anybody could gain the trust of these children, I knew that I could. And I knew that if these children didn't share the evidence of what had happened to them, then their abusers would be able to continue to abuse many more children. So on that basis, I put my own feelings in the background, and I agreed to go on that job, and I gave it my heart and soul, because I believed what I was being told. Now, we ended up with dozens and dozens of children again. And I did manage to get the cooperation of Amber and Ruby and Daisy and other children as well. But I gave them my word that if they told us what had happened, that we would support them all the way through to trial, that they wouldn't be abandoned, that they wouldn't be left alone, that this was really important. And they were no longer being abused. They were out of the abuse themselves. But they had begun to recognise that they had been exploited, that they had been failed, that the men who had raped them were predators, and they wanted to prevent that happening to other children. And to their everlasting credit, they agreed to put their lives on hold to share what had happened. And I spent 8 months really, every day, picking them up. We did multiple video interviews. They went to ID parades. They identified their abusers. And then, in the early days, it was very clear that this was a genuine attempt to do a full investigation. But over a period of perhaps a couple of months, things were happening that made not only me, but many of my colleagues recognize that something was going on here that didn't add up. So we had dozens of offenders. We had dozens of victims. On every major investigation that I'd worked on in 16 years, we always had analysts who would pull together the data. And if you think of the number of offenders and victims involved in this and the number of officers that were on that job at that point, one person didn't ever have that all in the head. It was impossible. And when we saw the analyst being removed from the case, when
And whose decision was that?
the senior investigating officers, I don't know who was pulling the strings, because the first SIO was clearly determined to see this job through, in my opinion. They then moved him against his will off the job, and they brought in another SIO who had never worked in serious crime, who had never run a major investigation, who had never had any training in the Holmes computer system that every major incident was run on.
Yeah.
So all these things raised concerns. The other thing that was very interesting was that the very first day that I worked on that job, we had an assistant chief constable who came and sat in the office in the room with us. And in all my police service, I never experienced that before or after. So the scrutiny was coming right from the top.
So where is the top in the police?
The chief constable.
But the chief constable isn't the most senior police officer in the land. There's the Home Office.
For me,
Where do you think these people are getting
pulling the
orders, aren't
strings?
they? These people are getting orders. The Home Office, looks at what's going on across the police forces. You've got the Met, which is the most senior police force.
I have no doubt that the strings for this in Rochdale were being pulled by the Home Secretary, by the Director of Public Prosecutions, who at that point was Keir Starmer. This was a joined up, deliberate and intentional insistence, not even an attempt because they succeeded, to conceal what was going on throughout the country. That is my absolute belief now. 100%. And the reason that I believe that as well, and the evidence will back it up, is because this, Operation Spaniel in Rochdale was not one isolated case. These cases were being negligently dealt with throughout the whole country at that time. Rotherham, Rochdale, Bradford, Huddersfield, Oxford, Telford. The thinking was joined up, and the pattern of neglect was the same throughout every police force. And the other thing that I would say, and I don't have the piece of paper to prove this, but I found out subsequently through the media. Nazir Assal was the prosecutor on Rochdale, and he subsequently made public that in 2008 the government, the Home Office, had sent out a circular under Gordon Brown that had instructed all police forces not to investigate these kinds of child abuse, that the children were making a lifestyle choice, that they were complicit in their abuse, and we shouldn't rock that boat. Now, subsequently, I find it really interesting that Nazir withdrew that allegation, but I don't believe that somebody who is a chief prosecutor would publicly go out on the BBC and publicly make that statement if he wasn't absolutely, categorically certain that it was true. But I've never been able to find that document. I've never actually, the interview that he did is really difficult to find even online now. But I believe that that's what was happening. I believe that there was a fear of Islamophobia, and that there was an absolute determination that this crime would be hidden. The other thing I will mention, Liz, and there's a few things that I can't go into right now in relation to Augusta, because they will blow this country apart. But I'm not at liberty to talk about it just yet. But what I would say is that I know that Operation Augusta was being run as a full major investigation until the night of the 6th of July 2005. That was a full major investigation. My husband died on the 5th of July 2005. The last entry on the Augusta database was made on the night of the 6th. On the morning of the 7th, we had the London bombings, and there was a fear of Islamophobia, and not one more entry went on that database. That job was closed down after that. Now, I'm told since that the decision to close Augusta was made in April. I don't believe that. So for me, all these little signs and signals are showing me that this was never a real attempt to follow where the evidence leads. This was being driven by a different agenda. Originally, a fear that the documentary would highlight what was going on in Manchester. They wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be a public outcry. When there wasn't, they quietly allowed it to fade away, be buried. And officially, that job never existed, because the Holmes database it's a very secure database. The evidence held on that doesn't go onto normal police systems. So that job was shut down. All that evidence was not on GMP intelligence systems. It was nowhere. When I went public in 2013 and began to talk about this, it didn't exist. So gradually, and I was very naive back then. I'm not naive now. So, I'm saying to you what I truly believe to be the truth. And that's what I said from day one. But when I decided to resign from the Rochdale case, because I saw a repeat of what I saw on Augusta, I spent 18 months as a serving police officer trying to get action taken, going to the chief constable, the head of public protection, the IOPC, the Home Office, the Children's Commissioner. Nobody wanted to hear. And I was told, one of the things that was said to me was, senior officers make decisions, and as a junior officer, you do as you're told. And if you can't do that, you're in the wrong job. And I always say, I never promised to do as I was told. I promised to uphold the law. And protecting children who are being raped is my job. And you should hang your heads in shame if you know what I know, which they did, and you are turning a blind eye.
What did they say when you challenged them?
I was told that I should be very careful what you do with this information. And like that, it was a wagging finger. You are a serving police officer. You signed the Official Secrets Act. This information is confidential, and you could go to prison if you go public with this. So I went into a very, very dark place. I had two choices. I was told, what I've just said to you. I was also told, come to work, put your bum on a seat, get your wage, and go home. But I didn't join the police to do that. I wanted to do good. I wanted to make a difference. And I'm not bothered about somebody talking on the mobile phone. I'm not bothered really if they park on double yellow lines. But I am bothered if a child is being raped. And to tell me to, be quiet, it's not your place to rock the boat. Well, no, it is my duty. And it's your duty to make sure that the law is upheld. And we have got children here who are crying out for help. And you are deliberately, knowingly failing in your duty to protect them. And, and I was not going to take no for an answer. But when I realised that nobody would listen, that I was the problem, it was actually a terrifying realization that I might go to prison. I knew that I'd lose my career and my income. I actually lost my home. I ended up in a little apartment with a lodger, not knowing how I was going to pay my bills. But I say this, because it's true. But I sat at home. Actually, my last day at work, I ended up unconscious on the floor because it made me really ill. And I am a strong person. I'd lost my husband. I'd lost my little granddaughter. I have lived through tough times in my life. But the decision from realizing what I was seeing again in Rochdale to deciding that I really had no choice other than to speak out was it was the most terrifying 18 months, 2 years of my life.
A quick note from our sponsor. This episode is brought to you by Native Path. And I'll say this up front, I'm deeply skeptical of most health products, especially collagen. The market is crowded, big promises, flashy branding, very little scrutiny. So before we partnered with anyone, we asked a simple question. Is there actually a high-quality collagen out there? We dug into the research. Sourcing, processing, ingredients, what to avoid, and what actually matters. That investigation led us to Native Path. They stood out because they do what most brands don't. A single ingredient collagen with over 9,500 5-star reviews that say it works. No fillers, no sweeteners, no gimmicks, just collagen produced to a higher standard. Right now you can visit getnativepath.com/trust to view the research that changed my mind, including the collagen warnings most brands won't tell you. Read it and decide for yourself. That's getnativepath.com/trust. Plus a special bundle deal at a fraction of the retail price, backed by a risk-free 365-day guarantee. Visit getnativepath.com/trust.
All it takes for evil to thrive is that good people do nothing. And it still makes me feel really sad that it fell to me to have to speak out. But I can look myself in the mirror and I know I tried. And all I really wanted back then in 2012 was to know that I had told the truth. And so I resigned in the October. I'd been watching through the summer Hillsborough like unfolding and seeing families who had lost 30 years of their lives trying to get to the truth. And I've got 4 kids of my own, and I thought, in 30 years' time, I might not be here. And if this is made public, my kids are going to say, well, my mum worked on those jobs. Why did she not say anything? And so that really is what made me decide that wherever it led, I was going to go with my conscience. I was going to tell the truth. And so I actually went to Panorama. I resigned in the October. I went to Panorama, and I really feared that I would go. I feared they would come and knock on the door. But Panorama were right at the beginning of the Jimmy Savile scandal. And the BBC were mired in all of that sexual scandal. So they linked me up with File on 4, and I worked with File on 4 for about 3 months. And some of those children that had put their faith in me in Rochdale, they were part of that documentary. When I resigned, I went straight back to them. And it was before then, but in the time after I walked off that job, I walked off the job when I was told that the powers that be had decided they were no longer going to use Amber. And this was a young girl who she'd given 8 months of her life to us. I had given her cast iron guarantees that had come from the chief constable, and then they decided they've changed their mind. So that's when I walked off that job. But when I resigned, I went back to the family. What had happened is that in relation to Ruby, even though we had a fetus, we had DNA, we knew that Adil Khan was the 43-year-old married Pakistani Muslim father of 3 who had got her pregnant. There was no debate about that. Ruby had a statement of special educational needs. She couldn't consent anyway. She was 12 when he started to abuse her. The decision was made to charge him not with rape, but with conspiracy to commit sexual activity with a child. He was out of prison in just over 3 years. In relation to Amber, as the barrister got her head around the case, she realised that the whole of the Rochdale case was built on a statement, on a document that Amber had provided to me. It was document 29 that had named many of the abusers in the Rochdale case. And by binning her as a victim, her evidence was then just hearsay, and it was inadmissible in a court. But we're a couple of months now before trial. What do? They decide that the only way to get that evidence into court is to name her on the indictment as one of the gang of paedophiles. And so they did it, but secretly. So they never arrested her. They didn't caution her. They didn't interview her. Why? Because any lawyer worth their salt would have said, well, a year ago, the top lawyer in the CPS scrutinised Amber's case and decided that she was a victim. How can you now be saying that she is one of the offenders? There is no new evidence, because this is evidence from 2 years ago. She's no longer involved. So they decided they'd do it secretly as a tactical option, and that I'm quoting that. It was a tactical option. Now, when I went back to visit Amber after I had resigned, to say to Amber and to Ruby, I will support you in seeking compensation, in taking action against the police. First of all, they wouldn't let me in the door because they'd been told that I just abandoned them. But when we finally did start speaking and I explained what had happened, I can remember Amber breaking down and saying, "Oh my God, now I understand what's happening." Because what was happening was that in order to justify their treatment of Amber as this honey monster, they called her, an abuser who had been recruiting children for the gangs, not portraying her as the victim that she was, they decided that they were going to try to justify that decision. And so what they did, they tried to take her own children away from her based on the fact that she was an alleged child abuser. So when she had her second baby, they pretended that they had a court order and they tagged the baby when she gave birth.
Is this the police or the social
Police and
workers?
social services. But there was no court order. So she was trapped in the hospital with a baby that was tagged, and they took her to court. The matron on the ward, after 2 or 3 days, demanded the paperwork, and there was no paperwork. So they allowed Amber to go home with her baby. A week later, she was standing in a court in front of a judge. It took a year. And at the end of that year, the judge threw it all out. And he said to social services and the police, if you ever bring this child, this young woman, she was a young woman by this time, in front of a court again, this case comes to me. He said, I have never seen anything like this in my career. And he said to Amber, Amber, you go home and you get on with your life. Now, 10 years after that, after I'd, gone public and fought for 10 years, the drama, the betrayed girls, Andy Burnham's review, I've countless, sharing publicly what had happened. Finally, the new Chief Constable, Steve Watson, after the Rochdale review was published, he acknowledged that the handling of the Rochdale case was incompetent, borderline incompetent was his exact words. He officially acknowledged Amber as a victim, and all her rapes now are officially recorded with her as the victim. I took several of the Rochdale girls and also some of the Augusta girls for personal apologies. They all received compensation when we sued the police. So I'm not making this up. It shouldn't have fallen to me to do this. This is the job of the police and the state. Our primary role is to protect the vulnerable and uphold the law. And what I have seen is corruption at the highest level of government, because I believe these decisions have come from the Home Office, from the Director of Public Prosecution, and they've been filtered through the National Police Chief Council in policy, that this is how you will behave on all these investigations. And I still believe that that is what is going on in the reluctance to do an inquiry. There's still an insistence that they're not going to uncover this. And I've always said, Liz, that, child abuse has come from everywhere, whether it's, a priest in the Catholic Church or Jeffrey Epstein or Harvey Weinstein or Jimmy Savile. The law is there to follow the evidence. And if you can prove that a 40, 50, 60-year-old man is raping a 12-year-old child, I'm sorry, you don't cherry pick who you prosecute. You go for it. And that's what I promised to do. So,
Maggie, as you say, there is clearly a huge amount of corruption here. And you mentioned the word Islamophobia. And we've heard that recently. We've heard the government were going to legislate against Islamophobia. They're now calling it anti-Muslim hatred. To what extent do you think it was leaders in the Muslim communities in these towns putting political pressure on local councillors, the local police? Or to what extent do you think it was the human rights lawyer tendency, the kind of pro-migration orthodoxy that started in the Blair years that just didn't want to acknowledge the problems that we had with the complete lack of integration we'd seen in towns like Rochdale or Rotherham.
I think it's a huge part of the conversation. I know that when I was working on Augusta, for instance, we had what were called IAGs, independent advisory groups, and they were advising the senior police officers about how to manage crime in their communities. So, in other words, we will deal with these issues in our community. We don't want to we don't want to rock the boat. And, I go back to the same point I made. The law should be equal. And I think it is, I'm a massive believer in freedom of speech. I do believe that we have to have difficult conversations. And this difficult conversation, if we didn't have it and we don't have it, I believe that it's children's lives that continue to be destroyed. And, I
But we see the same with the West Midlands Chief
Yeah, we do.
Constable, who essentially had outsourced policing to the Muslim community.
Yeah.
And how long has this been going on in the police? You said you joined in 97. Was it already there then? Or did it get worse? Did you have more of this pressure that so-called community leaders would be essentially making decisions?
I think it's become far, far worse. I think policing now has been politicized. I think we've lost our way as a country with law and order. I think we need a complete overhaul of the whole criminal justice system. It's become, I mean, in my charity, in the foundation, we're dealing with cases today, Liz, where victims of sexual abuse are waiting years for a trial. And yet, I guess that the example that everybody will know is the example of Lucy Connolly. She went online, she put some words which she deleted 20 minutes later. She was arrested. She was in court the next day. She was in prison within a couple of days, almost serving as much as some of these child rapists. That for me is terrifying, because if we can't, I think one of the main reasons that these Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs have been allowed to flourish is because the conversations that we needed to have around them were silenced.
But did you see in places like Rochdale or Manchester, was everybody locally aware of what was going on? And was the complicity on the parts of other parts of the Muslim community that weren't directly involved? Was it an open secret?
I honestly have to say I don't know, because I didn't know it existed until I went on Operation Augusta. But I think that the communities in Rochdale knew, and I think that those at the top of policing also knew. I didn't. But what I have seen since has led me to absolutely believe that there has been a concerted effort to minimize the extent to which this kind of abusing exists. And the only reason that makes sense to me about why that would be is because they don't want to, they want to hide this. That, they want to pretend it isn't happening. And I always say is that child abusers come from everywhere. We've had, most abuse happens in the home. I don't dispute that. But it is only in this kind of child abuse that I have ever seen the state become involved in trying to conceal it.
But do you think the media are complicit as well?
I think the media have remained silent around this. When I first went public, It was being, they described it as Asian grooming gangs. And I would always say, these child abusers, they're not from Japan or Thailand or China. And actually, they're not Sikh members of the community from India or Pakistan. In my experience, in this kind of abuse, I have seen members of these very, very sophisticated gangs that have networks that spread throughout the country, often family networks. But I have seen other members of the gang that are perhaps from Afghanistan or from Iran, but they are still of the Muslim community. And the worrying part for me, and I'm not a racist, I am the furthest from a racist that you would ever get. I believe in people traveling and, learning about other cultures. But I do believe that we should have a set of rules in our country that everybody who lives here has to adhere to. And we cannot bend those rules just to keep one particular group of people happy.
And also, wouldn't you have thought the best way of dealing with Islamophobia is stopping the grooming gangs, stopping Pakistani Muslim grooming gangs that are giving a very, very bad name to the entire Muslim community.
Yeah.
And, we've heard very little from community leaders
Yeah.
about dealing with these gangs. I mean, you mentioned the Catholic Church earlier.
Yeah.
And of course, there have been abuses in the Catholic Church, there have been abuses within the BBC. But ultimately, those organisations had to deal with it. And we've heard nothing. And it's this complicity. It's this complicity that is part of the problem. And I worry about the Labour Party in particular being desperate to cling on to the Muslim vote. And we've seen that with, the rise of the Islamist separatists and the fact 4 of them got elected to Parliament. But it's also shocking to me that over 14 years of Conservative government, even though there's not the same electoral pressure on Conservative MPs, that this issue was never really dealt with. It sort of popped up. We had the 2017 Three Girls documentary appear. There was reporting in the Times, but then it sort of went under the surface again. What's your explanation for why the entire establishment just have ignored this issue?
I'd be a millionaire if I had £1 for every time I've asked myself that question, because, I do think, you mentioned the Catholic Church. I do think that there was a time when the church covered it up. They, to the extent of their ability. There were look at what happened in Ireland and all of that. It was covered up. The BBC covered up Savile. So I think that this is
we're in the cover-up phase.
We're in the cover-up point of this particular kind of abuse. In 50 years, we will look back at this. But the difference is that in the abuse in Ireland, the church covered it up. If one of those children had gone to the police, I don't believe that the police would have covered it up in the way that I've seen the cover-up around this crime.
So has the police been infiltrated?
I still think this goes to the top. I'm not a party political person, and I had numerous, the Conservatives, as you say, they were, when I resigned in 2013, the government was a Conservative government, and I am saying exactly the same things now as I was then. I spoke to Priti Patel, Suella Braverman, Rishi Sunak, all talked the talk, but didn't walk the walk. Yes, I worked on the drama Three Girls for 4 years, and that raised awareness. We then had ICSA, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, and I was one of the non-institutional core participants. And I had World War III. I was involved in the organised network strand, and from even before it started, it was so clear it was going to be a whitewash. None of the towns and cities where this had happened. So that is not about the community. That is about the government. They set the terms of that inquiry. They had 2 weeks of chief police officers, heads of social services, all being paraded out to say how great things are now, which, as somebody working in this area every day, I knew was a lie. But the actual inquiry, the aim was to cover it up again, not to share the truth. So this thinking and this, I say it's corrupt. It's a cover up. Who is pulling the strings? I honestly don't know. I think there is. You cannot ignore that many of the Labour constituencies are made up of this community. So they are going to be looking at the voting base. I don't think it's quite that simple, though. I think there is a lot more going on here. I think resources are one of the things, priorities, resources, policing on its knees, not enough police officers. They are complex.
But they're still arresting comedians at Heathrow Airport. I mean, he's
an easy target, though. It's an easy target.
This is the point, though, that, how many people are being arrested every day for violating, hate speech laws or whatever.
100% agree.
And what I've seen, and I was a minister in 6 different government departments, is often ministers don't get told the full truth about what's going on. That there is a system that has lots of different fiefdoms in it. So nobody really sees the whole picture.
I can believe
and as you say, I really identified what you said earlier about people get promoted who don't challenge the system.
Yeah.
The quickest way to get booted out is to say something original or challenge one of the senior people in your organisation. I saw that in the Foreign Office. I saw that in the Treasury. Wow. I saw the civil servants that got promoted were the ones who were prepared to say the latest woke mantra, to wang on about climate change, or whatever else was the fashionable issue of the day.
Yeah.
And what has essentially happened in Britain is we have had a takeover of our establishment, and in that I include the police, I include the civil service, I include organisations like the Bank of England, large parts of the media like the BBC, and they have all subscribed to this ideology. And part of the ideology is diversity is our strength. Isn't it great we're a multicultural country? Only today we've heard Keir Starmer attack Jim Ratcliffe over a statement that Britain had been colonialised. So we have this, and they really, really, really do not want to acknowledge the truth about what's happening in our country. And it's actually very hard to get to the truth because often you can't watch the truth on the mainstream media.
No, I agree with every word you've just said there. And, I've picked my battle, but I am an expert in my subject. And what government needs is people who are experts in their subject. And that doesn't happen.
No, they need people with morals. They need people with morals and integrity.
They do.
I would,
and knowledge, though.
I look at you, Maggie, and I think, why aren't you a chief constable?
Because I wouldn't tell the lie.
But the point is, that is the kind of person, you are the kind of person we need.
Thank you.
As a chief constable with a moral compass. And frankly, the chief constables we have at the moment are the ones who won't call out what's happening.
I know. And, when I started this journey, I knew that I was not going to make friends. The first person I went to was Peter Fahey, who was my chief constable. And I went to him as an officer that was seeing something that I thought would bring the police service in Manchester into disrepute. And I didn't believe that he knew what was going on. How naive was I? He would not even meet me. But and he was made a sir. We are rewarding obedience. We are not rewarding integrity and skill, and that's what our country needs. So I was asked to stand against Andy Burnham as the mayor of Manchester, but I would rather talk about something that I know inside out, that I can make some difference in, because I would not be a person who would do as they were told. I've got very strong principles and really strong beliefs, but I'm happy to be proved wrong, but I'm not wrong on this. And I wished, when I'd been looking at it early doors, that I could have somehow persuaded myself that I was wrong. But, and the thing is, it's like with Jeffrey Epstein now, isn't it? All those people who surrounded him, and all his cronies, and all these wealthy world leaders, whether or not they were involved in abusing children, in a way, is only half of the question. They had a moral responsibility to call it out. And I think what I believe is that we all have that responsibility. And I'm trying to build an army of people who share those views. And I do think that in the time since I started to speak out, people are finding their voice. The mainstream media have been really silent on this issue. I've battled to be heard, and I like live interviews because they can't edit me down. I think the message has come through now in a way it wasn't there 12, 13 years ago. But I also feel that accountability is a really important part of bringing change. Everybody in a high place up to now has not been held
Nobody's
accountable.
been held to account.
Nobody.
No police officer, even though some were even involved in committing the crimes.
Which I know.
No social worker has
I
been
know.
held to account. No politician has been held to
I
account.
know. And
And what? So you said about these police officers. If that is known, why have these people not been brought to justice?
again, who is controlling the narrative? Why are cases closed down? I think that is coming. And I'm working with every breath in my body to do that. I've set up my charity, which is to help individual survivors, either with emotional support or with advocacy, when they're being failed now by the system, by the police, where they're being fobbed off. We will advocate for them. We give ongoing emotional support and group therapy, which we as a small charity, national, we pay for. We take no money from commissioned money, because from day one I made the deal with myself that I would rather that we don't exist than compromise the truth. So we're very different. In the middle, I call it Force for Change work, and we're trying to share examples of where the system is corrupt, where it's failing, where there's systemic failures.
Has there been any improvement in terms of what's happening at the ground? Are the fewer cases than there were before? I know the gangs are still operating, but is there more awareness amongst the potential victims?
I think there is a much greater awareness. I think the methods used have changed. In the Augusta days, a fancy car would pull up outside a children's home and pick up the kids going to school or coming back. That's changed in that they do the grooming online now, so it's harder to sometimes spot. I think one of the major problems is the lack of experienced officers in policing. Experienced detectives have gone, and those who are still in the job can't wait to get out. They're recruiting young officers, and the retention rate for police officers is diabolical, because it used to be a career that was rewarded. You had skills, you had good training, people were in it for life. That's gone, and these cases are very complex cases to investigate. A kid of 21 who's just arrived in the nick really doesn't have the capability to investigate these cases. And I think one of the problems is, Liz, is that you've just referred to it. We're becoming a country that only polices the easy crime. So yeah, go and arrest somebody at the airport, lock up Lucy Connolly. In my charity, we spotted a pattern of behaviour where vulnerable women, there was one man, but vulnerable women were being unlawfully arrested, unlawfully strip searched in order to silence them. And we highlighted it. We went to Sky and the Bear Review was put together. This was 2 years ago. And the official findings of that report was that those women were being treated, the treatment was barbaric. That's now. So, what we're trying to do is highlight the current failures as well as the past failures, fight for change, and also the third strand to what I'm doing. I'm joined with some survivors of grooming gangs, and we have set up a mechanism, a limited company called Action for Accountability Limited, and we are trying to build a legal case against senior public servants for misconduct in a public office. Now, I'm not dying until I see a senior official in prison, because they have destroyed knowingly thousands and thousands of lives, and it was their duty to do something about that. So I do think that change will come when senior police officers, social service, council leaders, if they believe that they may be held personally, legally to accountable, I think we will see change, because those people in those positions of power now will look over their shoulder and think, maybe they'll come after me if I don't make the right decisions. I think without that, without personal accountability, I think the institutions, they gather around those at the top, protect them, and that's why they get the knighthoods, in my opinion.
Oh, I completely agree.
And
Elon Musk has offered to fund cases against the perpetrators, against the officials who've been found complicit. Has he been in touch with you to
no,
offer?
it hasn't. But he can find me on. You know what?
Elon, if you get in touch with me, I'll put you in touch.
Yeah, you
Maggie,
put in
you
touch
could
with me.
find the
Yeah.
fund cases.
I'm sort of treading. It's often a tightrope that I tread, because I don't get involved in party politics because we're running a charity. I will speak to anybody who wants to hear the truth, who wants to bring change. But you have to be careful as well, because different people have different agendas. And but I think that there's enough room in this country for many people to get involved in this conversation, because we are a long way from resolving it. I think the public are 10 years behind where I was when I resigned. But in 10 years' time, I hope that we will be further on. I think there has been a little bit of movement in the, recent trials. The sentences have been far greater than when I worked on the Rochdale case. The Rochdale case was presented as this, and I'm quoting, a fantastic result for British justice. Well, you go and tell Amber that. You go and tell Ruby that. When she didn't even know her rapist, who'd got her pregnant at 13, was out of prison until she bumped into him in the local supermarket. Those 3 men who were supposed to be deported on being released from prison are still roaming the streets of Rochdale. Well, actually, one of them isn't, because he secretly escaped from the country a couple of months ago, probably gone back to Pakistan, but we never deported him.
This, to me, it's the most egregious example, but it is yet another part of what has happened to our system and our state. It is rotten. It's rotten. It's the Home Office.
Yeah.
It's, I'm afraid, in the Foreign Office. It's in the Treasury. It's in our police forces. It's in the BBC.
It's heartbreaking.
And we need accountability. That's what's needed. People need to be held to account.
I agree.
For what they have done and what they do. Thank you so much, Maggie.
My pleasure.
For coming on the show. It's been
Thank you.
It's been fascinating, and I wish you every luck and every piece of success in bringing these people to justice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
What we have heard from Maggie Oliver is absolutely shocking. Britain is broken. The rape gang crisis is the most egregious part of a corrupt system that covers its own back rather than caring about truth, justice, and the welfare of British people. It's not alone, though. We can see similar behaviour by the authorities with the Post Office scandal. The leadership of the Home Office, the Crown Prosecution Service, and the police have failed morally. Despite years and years of coverage, no Home Secretary has been willing or able to grip this. Yet we know that when the system wants to act, as it did in the aftermath of the Southport killings, it does so swiftly and harshly. Those who closed down investigations, failed to prosecute perpetrators, and gerrymandered the process need to be held to account. People need to go to jail for misconduct in public office. These issues go right to the top. Keir Starmer, who was the Director of Public Prosecutions at the time of Operation Span, needs to be investigated. The whole way our public services operate needs to change. The police have been a self-governing oligarchy for too long. There needs to be a clear chain of command. Police leaders should be hired and fired if they fail to do their job of pursuing justice without fear or favour. Likewise, the Crown Prosecution Service and the Home Office bureaucrats have hidden from view. These authorities need to be made accountable. But this issue goes wider than criminal justice. The underlying reason that the Liberal establishment doesn't want a reckoning on the rape gangs is that it destroys their whole worldview. Their policies have made Britain worse, and the public are angry. The country has deteriorated in the era of mass migration. The Human Rights Act has made British human rights worse. British culture is superior to the alien cultures that have been imported. The establishment would rather lie and cover up than deal with the situation honestly. We see the same lack of truth-telling, groupthink and institutional capture right across the British government. It's in the Treasury, the Climate Change Committee, the Bank of England, the Business Department and the Foreign Office. There needs to be a restoration of truth and integrity. This will take new people and a new system. To hear more about how we can change Britain, you can listen to my audiobook 10 Years to Save the West, wherever you get your audiobooks. Please subscribe to The Liz Truss Show on YouTube. And please subscribe to The Liz Truss Show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, where as well as this show, the Liz Truss Show podcasts on Mondays and Wednesdays. Thank you for tuning in.